I'm Josh Swartz.
And I'm William Illingworth.
Hosts of the High Tech Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now.
Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others.
Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Miriam Plotinsky. She is an instructional specialist and the author of the book, Lead Like a Teacher, How to Elevate Expertise in Your School. What an amazing book. You are going to learn so much. You're going to love this episode. Thanks for listening. And by the way, before you go, it'd be so cool if you went to my website, and it's so simple to leave a review there. All you got to do is go to stephenmiletto.com/reviews, and you go in there, and there's a little drop-down menu and a little place where you can review the podcast just from there. And it'd be so cool if you said some nice words and maybe gave me 5 stars. What do you think? That'd be so nice. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing, and enjoy the show.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests, and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Miletto. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. With Dr. Steve Miletto.
Miriam Plotinsky is an author and instructional specialist who addresses challenges in both teaching and leading across schools with a wide range of differentiated needs. A strong advocate for student-centered learning, she provides coaching and professional development for teachers and administrators. Her first book, Teach More, Hover Less, How to Stop Micromanaging Your Secondary Classroom, is a practical guide to a student-centered instructional approach that removes the necessity of teacher micromanagement. Her second book, Lead Like a Teacher, How to Elevate Expertise in Your School, which just recently came out, addresses how to close the empathy gap between administrators and teachers by bringing forth the instructional expertise and perspectives of teachers. Her third book, Writing Their Future Selves, Instructional Strategies to Affirm Student Identity, is slated for late 2023, so not too far down the road. Miriam writes for a wide array of education publications and is a regular guest on international podcasts. She is also a National Board Certified Teacher with additional certification in administration and supervision. Our focus today is Miriam's recent book, Lead Like a Teacher, How to Elevate Expertise in Your School. Miriam, thanks for joining me today. Great to have you back on the show, and say hi to everyone.
Hi, and it's great to be here.
Well, cool to have you here again, and I got to tell you, love this book. I read in your bio that you provide coaching and professional development for teachers and administrators. Could you talk a little about something that you have learned as a coach that you always want to remember?
I've learned a lot of things, but I think one of the big ones is that I'm just one very small piece of a very complex puzzle. So whenever I'm walking into a school or any kind of culture or environment as a visitor, which is typically what I do, I'm really more there to try to get a perspective that somebody on the outside might have and to see things that might not be as obvious to someone who's closer. And so it's really about fitting those pieces together and not so much about me acting in any kind of capacity as the ultimate expert, the ultimate authority, because that's not how I think of myself at all. Don't think that coaches should think of themselves that way. It's always a collaborative stance of what does each individual person, factor, whatever you have in front of you bring into this equation.
That is so awesome. And, it's funny, a lot of times I ask guests questions like, if you could go back in time, because it's the longer we do this stuff, there's a payoff with experience that helps us kind of shortcut things. Do you have something like that you wish you'd known when you started that you've kind of learned over time?
I think when I started, I remember looking at older, more experienced teachers, because I started when I was a baby. I was 21 years old, and so they were all older, everybody.
Nice.
And my students were 4 years younger than I was. And I remember looking at them and thinking, wow, they've got it all figured out. They know exactly how to do this job. They seemed so comfortable in their own skin and so relaxed. And I think what I learned over time was that, first of all, that was just a wonderful facade that everybody carries with them when they have a certain amount of experience, but also the best teachers and the best administrators, I think probably the best anybody, if anything they do, understands that they don't have it figured out. And that we're all in a space where we have to not be comfortable because we haven't figured out, but be comfortable because we know that we haven't, and that we have so much left to learn, and to embrace that as opposed to being goal oriented. Like, I have to get there, because we all know that goals are tricky. Once we get there, there's someplace else we need to go, or we need to keep whatever it is that we have. And that's a scary way to live. Like, oh, my school had the highest achieving whatever this year. Okay, now I'm terrified of next year. So we have to think of it more as a process.
I like that. That's yes, completely terrified of next year. It is something. It's a process. You're learning, and I love that too, because it's the whole idea of looking and thinking that there is such a thing as having it figured out. That's one of those. Because when you get there, you realize there is no figuring it out, and there's no pinnacle. It's like I've not reached the mountaintop. What happened? So
yeah, it's a movable point.
Yes, that's not fair. It's not supposed to be that way. You're supposed
no, and progress is not linear.
You got that right. So today we're focused on your book, Lead Like a Teacher: How to Elevate Expertise in Your School. Why'd you write this book?
I spent a lot of time in different conference rooms, is really what it comes down to. Because when you walk into a school and you're going in there as a coach or a specialist or someone who wants to help them with something, you typically go into a conference room. And you sit down and you talk about whatever it is you're trying to troubleshoot. And sometimes it's a giant laundry list of things, which is a problem unto itself, because you can't fix a giant laundry list of things. And sometimes it's a little bit more focused. But what I noticed over time was that really two things began to appear. First of all, there was rarely a teacher who appeared in that space. And second, when a teacher did appear in that space, it seemed to be a happier place. You walk into a school, and this is going to sound a little bit, woo-woo, but like you can feel the culture when you walk in. You can feel a place that's not feeling so good about itself. You can feel a place that is more functional. And I know that when someone like me walks in, sometimes there's like a dog and pony show that also occurs. If let's all, everyone snap to attention, but you can tell the difference between genuine usually and not genuine. So in this case, I remember people would talk about, teachers will do this and they need this and they need that. And it was a they. And I was thinking, but if there were a teacher at this table, would they agree with you? And where's the we? And are we coming together to build something, or is this a box that we're checking off for? Because, schools have these things they do every year with theme. Like, this is our theme this year. We're going to work on this. And then the next year, they're working on something else. And I don't know how much of that sometimes is surface level, like we feel like we need to do it, and how much of it is really based on something that is perceived as an actual need. So I wrote it because I really felt like teachers were not often enough being called to that conference table or whatever space it is where the decisions are made. And you had people saying things like, oh, well, they're invited whenever they want. But are they really going to show up? Because they know they're not really invited. They might be technically invited, but they know they're not welcome. So that was one of the biggest motivators for getting this started.
I love that. This is, it's especially the commentary about the they. I was on a committee a long time ago as an assistant principal, and it was for certification of the school and stuff like this, for it to receive its. Oh my gosh! I can't believe I can't think of the word. It is. What word am I looking for when you get your
accreditation?
Thank you, accreditation. Yes, thank you. Oh my gosh! So I was on this committee at this school where. They divided up, it's very large faculty. It had just under 200 staff that included all the teachers, administration, and office staff, everybody. And we were supposed to, they broke up the school into all these different committees, and I was on the committee for mission and vision of the school, right? And there was like 33 of us in this group, all right? It was a good chunk, including the principal. And I'm the only other administrator on there, and we're waiting, and he's not there, and they started looking at me and saying, is this like college where if you wait like 15 minutes, if they have a doctorate, you have to wait like 20? And I said, no, we got to wait because we know he's in the building. And well, eventually what happens is he comes in, he goes, I got it. Here's what the mission and this is what the vision is going to be. And he had created his own little printed out folder, like a brochure. And he said, what do you think? And they all looked at me like what? And, kind of like if you've ever seen like Shrek movies with Puss in Boots, the eye thing where he can make his eyes look like puppy dog eyes. The cat can, and they're all looking at me like, please, we'd like to go home, and
because why are they there?
Exactly. It's like, we're not here for any reason. And so I said, yeah, it sounds great. And he said, oh, super. So you guys can all go home now. And that was
well, that's a master class in what not to do.
Yes, exactly. And I tell that story because, it's like, it was funny because we all came that day expecting that we were going to have some role in this. And I think sometimes, going back to what you're talking about, is that we're, suddenly we were the they. It's like, and so all of us have experienced that at some time where it's like, yeah. I want your ideas, but I've got the idea. So
well, but that's pretty pervasive. I remember, I was talking to a friend who teaches at an independent school, and he was saying they had a new head of school come in, and it took a year for the head of school to establish a new mission and vision. And I'm thinking a mission and vision should not be about who's in charge of the school. It shouldn't be about the topmost administrator. It's about a lot of people. Now, maybe 30 is too many cooks in a kitchen to develop anything productively, at least the way that was organized, especially if nobody can move forward unless the one person is there whose opinion counts. But wow, that's not what a mission or a vision is. It's supposed to be a shared enterprise.
That it is, and it's kind of funny. But just know that you brought back these memories as I was reading your book, especially in the beginning, because I could do a whole podcast on just what I'm about to ask you about, which is, in the beginning of Lead Like a Teacher, you have a short segment titled "Shared Purpose." Could you explain why you included this segment?
It should be obvious, but I don't think it is, that unless everybody's on your bus, you're not going anywhere. And I actually think there's a quote in this book that I love that actually is about buses from Maya Daughtery, who's one of the wise people that I love to have in my life. She said, and this is on page 3, right under that shared purpose heading, the challenge is that even though we're on the same bus, we're all looking out different windows. It's the same landscape, but with different perspectives. The bus driver's job is to make it all fit together. And I love that. But the whole point is that we have to be on that bus. If I'm on a bus and you're on a train, it won't work.
That's so important right there, yes.
Right, but you walk into a lot of schools and people are in all these different vehicles. And they're pursuing their own agendas and what matters to them. And what happens is that it's a forest and trees approach. It becomes, for teachers, very details oriented. This is what I can control. My locus of control is my classroom, my students. That's where I'm going to have my domain because I don't have any influence over what happens out there. And when the administrator says, well, my locus of control is the whole building, and so I have this big picture perspective that you don't have, that's also true. Both are very important. But the issue is that neither person can clearly see what the other is doing in a dysfunctional environment.
I love that analogy, by the way, because one of the things that's going on here is that, because you always also have people that are like on motorcycles, they're zipping out. Others, it's like, get out of my way, man. And then you got the big aircraft carrier that's, someone's put some wheels on and they're kind of floating down the hallway too. So it works really well. And I do think we forget that there's a reason why we're here together, not in like isolated cubicles that are away in other cities or something.
Yes,
although
we share a common target.
That we do.
Which is kids.
Which is kids, yes, and it should be. Yeah.
Just make sure we're talking about the same target. It's kids. We're all there to help children, and exactly. I think we forget that.
I think we totally forget that. I got to say this before we go any further. Something that I really love about the formatting of this book is you include scenarios. You don't just talk about the concept. You tell us stories. All right. So why'd you do that? Why'd you end up including that?
So first of all, I'm like a nonfiction writer with a fiction writer who's dying to get out of me. So I think that's part of it. That's just the selfish part of it. These are composites. They are not real situations that happened. And as I explained at the beginning of the book, they're also exaggerated for the purpose of making a point. But the reason is that I feel like we can read the scenarios and we've been in these conversations, we've been in these situations. And I wanted to put people into every single kind of exemplification of both functional and dysfunctional administrator-teacher relationships as they move through this book, because then there are tools right afterward that share a different way to be. And I think without the scenario, it wouldn't necessarily be as powerful. Plus, and this is again, sort of maybe a selfish thing, but when I read books, I like to be drawn in by stories. I feel like it makes the material a lot more approachable. So since this started in Lead Like a Teacher a lot more, and it's extending into my next books, and that's plural, with the scenarios. Because I have one coming out in November, but I just started writing a fourth.
Wow, you're a machine, man. That's awesome.
A little bit too much of a machine.
That's cool. It's well, the stories are awesome because they really get there. And by the way, I have to tell you this because this is coming from, I'm a former assistant principal and a former principal. All right. So my feelings were not hurt, but what I love is that you put this little asterisk in there, kind of like the fine print at the bottom on a commercial. And it says, I mean well. All right. So, which, I mean, it says more than that, but that's how I took it. And I said, yes, that's great.
That's good. I'm relieved, to be honest, and I'm being completely genuine. I'm so relieved to hear you say that because I think that both teachers and administrators get an interesting treatment in these scenarios.
Yes.
They're not always, neither one is portrayed positively all the time. They're portrayed positively some of the time. So I was hoping to be as even with that as I could. But again, like when you're trying to make a point, you draw out those characteristics that are not necessarily always the best ones.
You got that right, but you did a good job of it. It's kind of even there, and it's if nothing else, it's I like that you said that, and it's right there. So it says just take it for what it is, and so it fits with the story. So move on.
Right, take it with love.
You're right, exactly. Don't get your feelings hurt. We're good. I like that. Sorry, I had to make sure I mentioned that because I thought that was cool. In the second chapter called Hiring for Success, you recall an interview that led to an offer, but you have never figured out what you did right. And I'm sorry to laugh, but I read this thing and I read it over and over again because I'm like, understand what you're going through here. Could you share some thoughts about hiring?
It is such an opaque process, and it's usually one that is carried out so badly. I mean, we have these really important jobs that we are trying to get people to do. Teaching obviously is one of the most important jobs. You're going to be with children every day, carrying out whatever that mission and vision is and helping them learn. And then, for administrators, you're heading up these enormous, essentially, organizations. And then we get into district officials and superintendents. And sometimes they have these really brief or dismissive interviews, almost like where you're asked a series of questions. It's one kind of thing that you're exhibiting. You're exhibiting your ability to think on your feet, maybe exemplify something here and there, or maybe you're just being charismatic or dynamic. But your charisma or your dynamism in that moment doesn't translate to the kind of job you're going to do. So, one thing I talk about with hiring teachers especially, but I believe it's true of hiring anybody, is try to get a little bit more information about how they would perform in that job. I think we hire the wrong people all the time because we're looking at the wrong things.
Oh, you're so right. It's and this is such a powerful. It's such a powerful chapter because we really do. I mean, and you bring those thoughts to light because sometimes we get in the focus of just to hurry up and get it done. All right, I got to fill this spot. And sometimes we bring all these people together because someone's making us bring all these people together. And so we make sure everyone's got to ask a question. I was in an interview like that one time. They had 15 people in the interview team. And they each asked a question, but they told me we only have 30 minutes for the interview. And it's like, okay, I don't know about you guys, but I may be a history teacher, but I can do the math. It's, just 2 minutes for each question, and I'm at 30 minutes already. That's crazy. But I didn't say that because I wanted a job, but hey.
Well, and it's possible that in that 30 minutes, if you did not answer all 15 questions, in other words, if you tried to go in depth on something, that you would be penalized. Maybe they were following a point system, a ranking system, and that would have worked against you. So instead of giving a few really good answers, you gave a ton of not so good answers or less good answers because of the constraints of the interview. That makes no sense.
Makes no sense whatsoever. And you're exactly right, because I was warned at the beginning. We only have 30 minutes. We stop at 30 minutes, so you do not have time to explain. Just go.
The 30-minute panel interview is something in education that I've seen across districts, across the country, that people do. You sit down, you get a half hour. If there's time, you may or may not be allowed to ask questions at the end. To me, the question part is where I learn the most about a candidate. The kinds of questions they ask, what they want to know, that sometimes is the most revealing part of any interview, and we cut it off because we're trying to keep it fair, keep it equitable, make sure that everybody has the same experience. Well, that's not equity.
You got that right. You got that right. I got to tell you, because what it brought back was the memory of this interview. This was mine, because when you talk about, I totally understood why I did not get this job, but I was in Army training. I was an officer in the Army going through officer basic course, and I told my instructor there, my commander, I said, hey, my girlfriend may give you a call because I'm trying to apply for these different teaching jobs. And he said, not a problem. Well, when we came, we went in the woods and we did this whole escape and evasion thing. So my point in telling you that is there's no study in education, right? There's no talking about any of that stuff. I come out of the woods and he says, hey, LT, got to tell you something. And so I go over to him and he says, I said, yes, sir. And he says, your girlfriend did call and I told her, just go ahead and make the appointment. He said, so tomorrow you've got an interview for a teaching job. And I'm like, what? And he goes, don't worry. It's all taken care of. I got you the furlough papers. Everything's ready. And all you got to do is get your stuff together and get up there. And he told me where it was. So I go there. And what the guy really wanted was a middle school cheerleader sponsor, not a middle school cheerleader. He wanted a sponsor for the middle school cheerleaders. But he didn't tell anybody that question at the beginning. Remember, I told you I'd been in the woods. They kept asking me questions that had things to do with stuff that I hadn't looked at in 6 months, the length of this training. And, but it was just kind of funny because at the end he says, I saw more of his backside. He was getting ready for some sort of a honors night or something like that. And he's literally was going through files and pulling stuff out and stuff like this. So I saw more of his backside. I'm looking straight at him and he's asking me some questions once in a while. And at the end, he finally said, tell me what you know about cheerleaders. Well, that was random. Okay. Yeah. And then he was more specific. You want to be a cheerleading coach? And I said, whatever I said didn't get me the job. I was not interested in that whatsoever.
It wasn't your path. Whatever happened, it wasn't what was meant to happen.
Was exactly. And very glad, by the way. But the point is that, when I was reading this, I think about all the different times when, maybe I've hurried up and done something, or I should have taken some different amount of time, or it's been done to me. My all-time favorite one was I was interviewing for principal jobs. And after the it was that one with the 15 people, because I had 2 with them. They called me in for one, and then they said, what? You didn't get that one? We got another school that needs a principal. And so they called me in for that one. Both of them, at the end of it, they told you that the superintendent wants to meet every candidate that comes in. So I thought that was cool. So after you got meeting here, you're getting ready to meet with the superintendent. I don't know if you've ever seen Willy Wonka from Willy Wonka, the Chocolate Factory from the 70s, all right, the 70s version with Gene Wilder.
Are you kidding? That's the only one that's legitimate.
Thank you very much. I agree with you. And what was awesome was that, so there's a whole group of us that have gone through these 15-minute interviews. I mean, these 30-minute, 15-question interviews. And we're sitting there all looking at each other like, okay, so we were all the graduates of this. He comes out. The door opens. We're all sitting there looking at this door. This giant door opens. He walks out. There's all he was missing was a purple suit. And he says, hello, I'm glad you all interviewed with us. Wish you the best of luck and have a great day. And then the doors closed and he went inside. We didn't meet with the superintendent. He kind of said hi. So anyway.
And I wonder about this. There's this misplaced sense of consequence that we see in school districts, as people move up into administration and maybe into higher positions than that, where there's this idea of I'm more important than you, so it's a privilege to see me, and I'm not so accessible. And I noticed it was much more prevalent, or it seems to be much more prevalent in secondary spaces than elementary spaces. I don't know why that is. It's a cultural thing. But part of the empathy gap exists because administrators purposely keep themselves separate from teachers, not just physically, but emotionally and, professionally and job-wise. And when that happens, you're not going to have the space that you want to have because there's going to be a lack of trust no matter what.
It's right on the money. Yes, you got that right. One of the things that I got to bring to note here is in Chapter 3, titled Instructional Coaching, you say this: one common barrier to implementing stronger coaching structures often lies in the intimidating nature of the pieces that go into helping teachers grow. Could you talk about this a little bit more in context and detail?
If we had a coaching system that was really set up for the purpose of helping all teachers improve, or even helping teachers and administrators better one another in a collaborative stance, it would be a different story. But instructional coaching, a lot of the time, is reserved for teachers who are considered anywhere from mediocre to underperforming. And so we say we want to help your growth, but growth becomes a dirty word because growth really means or else. And the implication is if you don't grow and we don't have evidence that you're growing, you're going to stop growing here and you're moving on. So coaching becomes a threat. And one thing that my chapter proposes is all sorts of different coaching structures that elevate the people in the building who know the most about instruction at that time. And I would argue that as teachers and not administrators, because administrators, as good as they are, and as long as they've taught, they're not doing it anymore. And, I don't want to oversimplify this, but there is an element of the longer you've been away from something, the less you understand about it, especially in a rapidly changing world like the one we are currently faced with.
You are so right. It's funny because, that's the power of instructional coaches is amazing with people who have been practicing and knowing and understanding and trying then to figure out what it is that the person may need some real help with. But I think a prime example of what you're talking about is, not so many years ago, but pre-COVID, I feel like that should have its own initials or something. There was this word called differentiation that came out. And a lot of administrators would say, yeah, that's good. So go do differentiation. They had no clue what they're talking about.
You don't do differentiation. That's already a misuse of the word. And differentiation is something that teachers are doing more and more of because student needs are highly varied. And it's hard work and it takes a lot of skill, practice, and continuous tweaking. So it's and my foreword for this book is written, I have two forewords, but one of them is written by one of the associate superintendents in my district who did something rather novel, which was when he was a high school principal, a huge high school, he taught a class because he wanted to get back into the classroom. And this was in 2019, so right before the pandemic. And what he writes about is how much had changed since he'd been in the classroom. He didn't know what Google Classroom was or what kids were doing, the technology of how kids approach their class changed, also their mentality and attitudes. And this was 4 years ago. So it's gotten a lot more different since then. And I think we just need to remember that. I need to remember it too. I'm not in a classroom every day. And so I have the humility, I hope, to say to teachers, you are better at this right now than I am. And I believe that.
Oh, that is so... it's so important that certain messages are delivered and otherwise it's all just a threat or something like this. And that's not really, it's not wise. And if the person who's trying to, even if their intentions are good, they have to understand how to help as opposed to go do, this is the word for the day and I want you to do the word for the day. And I'm not going to provide you any training in it because I'm not quite sure what it means. And, what's funny, one of the things you made me think of was just the changes in technology, because there's a period of time where if you have been around long enough, it's you go from no email to pagers, pagers to these really wild telephones that were big, but the kids became masters of them. Then something called a BlackBerry, that the kids became awesome at, being able to not even look at and just blah, 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 manufacture whatever sentences. And then suddenly we're into this world of massive texting and all kinds of stuff. So if you just look at that stuff and forget email, because then by the time you talk about email, it's like, now you're getting 3,000 of them a day. So
well, and we're also dealing with what is probably maybe arguably one of the biggest mental health crises that we've encountered in recent history for kids. We're dealing with children who are acting in a way that we can't yet explain.
Right.
We don't yet know why. So, if I haven't been in a classroom during any of that, I really can't speak as well to what's happening.
Point well taken. Well made point. One of the things I got to tell you, because it's difficult because I could really you have awesome information and stories in each of these chapters, but I did have to choose my favorite because I can do that. All right.
Okay.
And one of my favorite chapters is chapter 6, Preventing Fires. On page 127, you comment, the life of secondary leaders often lacks balance. Could you put this statement in context with the chapter? Because this is so right on the money. It's yes.
I mean, there used to be a radio show in my hometown, which was Indianapolis, and they ran a segment called Mr. Obvious, where they would just say like really obvious things. Nice. And I feel like that statement's super obvious, like that secondary leaders don't have balance. But this is the thing that I do think that teachers don't understand sometimes, is how they never go home. I mean, you could be at school for these insanely long shifts. You might get there at 6, you might leave at 9 that night, and then wake up and do it all again the next morning. You don't go to work to get work done. You go to work to put out fires. And you know, the scenario that I picked at the very beginning of a chapter, it's an assistant principal, and she's trying to go home. She's actually trying to pick up her kid and take her kid out for ice cream because she hasn't done that in a really long time. And it's a clear day. Things are looking good. And all of a sudden, just one thing after another starts to happen. The principal needs something. One of the radiators or units in the classroom starts smoking. You know, all these things. The kid flips out in the hallway. This is the reality of being a secondary leader. You want to get into instruction. You want to do the things that are the best for kids and for teachers in the building. Your intentions are incredible. And you start the day, but you have no idea how it's going to turn out. The whole thing is probably going to implode in some way. And so I don't think that people appreciate that enough. And what the chapter attempts to do is to provide what strategies you can for whatever you can predict, what you can predict might happen, what could happen. And, you know, obviously taking into consideration that there's only so much you can plan for.
And I just think you've got it. You understand, because each of your chapters has something I can point to that says, you know, boom, boom, right. And this one, if you let it, the world will literally become nothing but putting out fires. And you're like, it's like, you got to stop that. And you got to do everything from scheduling your time and having someone who helps you protect that time. And then people, because
unless you're an adrenaline junkie, yes. Which some people might be, but unless you are, you're going to burn out.
You got that right. That's my all-time favorite one is usually when someone comes in the building and they're demanding to see somebody. And so that's where you have someone who protects your time, who says, I think this person can help you more than the principal can, or more than the assistant principal can. You know, maybe it's the department chair, or maybe it's, you don't need the department chair, you need this person. And redirecting and helping them see who they need to and end up being happy that way. But you end up being happy because you get to finish whatever it is you're trying to do. I always wonder about because I was secondary my whole career, and I always felt for my colleagues who were in elementary school who, you know, the kids are eating at 10 a.m. their lunch, you know, and so it's like, because in the high school I had to eat at 10:30 in order to keep me from eating at 2:30. So, because you had to be in the cafeteria and all that sort of stuff. Well, if the kids are eating at 10 o'clock, you know, yeah, I just drove in and now I'm going to have my breakfast and then I'm going to have my lunch and then I'm going to go in the cafeteria. I don't, you know.
Yeah, I try to explain this to lay people the people on the outside, why it is that I want lunch at 10:45 every morning, like how that got trained into me from a very young age.
There you go.
Like we just, and you know, my students are pulling out their lunches at 9 o'clock in the morning because it's there and they're hungry. It's just a very different life.
It is, isn't
I don't think anyone gets it. And like, I'm always made fun of by people in my family because I like to have dinner at like 4. Like, well, I never got out of the habit of being hungry because
nice.
You eat when you can.
Exactly. The timetables work that way. It's like, yes, we've got to do that. Just as a note, one of the things that gets burned into you as a high school person is the feeling to be in the hallway. I need to be in the hallway for some reason. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
No, it's true. You need to be in the hallway because if you're not in the hallway, things happen.
Yes, exactly. It's like, but you should have those feelings for the rest of your life. You know, it's like, stop. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so one of the things you get into is you talk about the importance of listening. Let's talk about that.
It's funny how we say things like, I'm a good listener. If we have a friend who likes to talk to us and we help them and we help them work through things. I don't think many of us are good listeners. I think most of us aren't. And it's because we have opinions about what should happen. And so we surround ourselves with yes people. And, I used to hear people say things like this. Like I had a former boss who would say, I'm interviewing people who match the culture of our school. And it took me years to break that down because it always just kept coming back into my brain, like the culture of our school. And I understood what this person meant, but what the translation was a person who's going to fit in with the people who are already here. So we don't want people who push back. We don't want people who have different perspectives, who are going to make our lives a little more challenging. For the most part, we want people who are like us. And when we're having a conversation, even if we are being silent, and in the book I have an example of somebody who's taking notes and really looks like they're listening. But what's going on in this person's brain the whole time is their own, yeah, and here's what I'm going to do. So we really have to fight actively, and I provide strategies for this, the urge in us that tells us to just immediately disregard everything but what we think is a good idea. And that's hard for most of us to do. But we're not wired like that. We're wired to really listen to our own voices. And that's why there's a whole chapter dedicated to active versus passive listening and, how do we employ, as administrators, how would we employ wait time strategies? They're not just for the classroom, those kinds of ideas.
And I love this chat. I love this when you get into this conversation because you cannot be an adult human being without at some point, I don't care what world you're in, somebody telling you, you need to get better at listening. What?
Yeah. What'd you say?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and it's one of those things, especially in our world, that we have multiple audiences. So if you're the teacher, are you listening to your colleagues? Are you really listening to your next door neighbor? Are you really listening? And I'm talking about like next door into school. And are you listening to your department chair? Are you listening at your meetings? Oh, how about the kids? Are you listening to the child who wants to tell you about the story they've written about the elves and the orcs and all those sorts of things that they created because they really like Lord of the Rings, and it's like the 12th time that day they found you and started telling you the next chapter or something like this? Are you listening to them, or are you like, yeah, kid, get away from me, you bother me? And
I remember like an old school lecture style professor type person starting a class with, the reason I'm standing up here and you're sitting there is that I know more than you do.
Nice.
And okay, maybe about the subject, good for you. I don't know, maybe. But what a perspective. And I sometimes think that, again, like the more we get promoted, the higher our positions are, we get that sort of inner, even if we would never say it out loud, even if we know enough to think that's not a good thought. I'm here for a reason and you're not. But that is exactly what's preventing you from making any progress in your own practice and from learning anything new. Because again, like going all the way back to what we were talking about in the beginning of this, once you think you have it figured out, you're probably doing a very bad job.
Oh, that's so right. God, that's so right. It's the practice of really listening has so many different levels to it. And, it's funny because people know when you really are listening to them. And one of my favorite stories is better, but it has to do with my own learning, is when one of the things I learned was instead of fighting fire with fire was to step back, create some rules that said things like, if you don't yell, I don't yell. I will not be yelling, so please don't yell and don't use profanity, and we're good, and I'll sit here and listen. And that would surprise people who are angry because they're expecting you to jump back at them and interrupt them and stuff like this. And I think too often we get in these discussions where we're constantly interrupting each other because we're thinking of the next thing to say. And it's unfortunate because that doesn't bode well, because somewhere in there is probably the important information we need, and we missed it. But
yeah, pretty much.
Great chapter. Great information.
Thank you.
Toward the end of Lead Like a Teacher, you say this: the hard part for leaders is not building their toolboxes. The challenge is matching what they know to the situations in which they find themselves. Oh my gosh, this is so cool. So explain what you mean.
So I'll make a teaching analogy for a second. I might have 5 classes and I won't use the same strategies with all 5 because the kids are different. They have different needs. And so Even if I'm doing a reading activity in one class, I might pick a different reading activity to do in the next class, just based on what I know. I think that part of being skillful in our jobs is matching what we know to the people that we're working with. And I don't mean lowering expectations. I don't mean changing the nature of what we expect or standards or any of that. What I mean is having the awareness to understand what's in your building. So if I am, for example, an assistant principal and I'm organizing a professional development that involves teachers doing some sort of differentiation process, am I going to plan it on my own? Or am I going to think, wow, there are some teachers in this building who do this really well. I'm going to talk to them and figure out what works for our whole population or our different departments. What's the best way to approach it? How can I make sure people are really buying into this and that it feels like they're doing with me, it's not being done to them, it's being done with them. It's really about knowing what's there and understanding it so that you can really get the best out of every opportunity that you're providing. And that takes discernment. And again, that takes awareness.
It's so awesome. It's, one of the things that it makes me think about is that, I guess the easiest way to say this is that it's easy to get caught up in the thing that, I use this, you wrote toolbox. So let's use a toolbox for a second. There are universal tools that have these different switchable heads on them and all this sort of stuff. And I think we get to thinking after a while that if it works there, then it must work here. And therefore, why aren't you responding to me the same way as Steve did over here? And now I've got Stefan over here. And why aren't you guys the same way? It's not working. Or if they even recognize that it's not working. I mean, I think that is so powerful to talk about. This is why I love your book. It has two very distinct audiences that I think often don't get any sorts of training like this, which is, or even any thoughts about it, is how to interact with each other. And instead, we just come out either thinking we know it or knowing we know it and just making whatever mistakes we make. And hopefully we learn from it. And if not, I'll survive. We'll move on or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things, because I sit in a job where I literally sit between these two groups of people and watch them interact. It's like, okay, well, we could be changing just a few things. And that's really the spirit in which this was written.
Oh, it's the spirit's well taken, because it's like, you look from afar or you look from a closeness and you're kind of like, I think I could help here. Just so important and so powerful. I mean, you've written a gem here, and I got to make sure I say this. You have another book coming out later this year, which we mentioned in the beginning, and not realizing that you had another book coming up after that one. So the one that's coming up immediately is called Writing Their Future Selves: Instructional Strategies to Affirm Student Identity. So give us a commercial. What's that going to be all about?
So this one I may have mentioned at the beginning. This is the closest to my heart. This was built on an idea that I started in Teach More, Hover Less, which is that we talk a lot about building relationships with kids, and that is so incredibly important, but we often build the wrong relationships or we don't go far enough. Kids will not grow as learners, as scholars, as thinkers, unless they believe that we feel that they are valid as learners in an academic space. We have to validate what I call academic identity. And so we have kids who think very badly of themselves, who have given into myths and stereotypes and tropes about themselves. And across all content areas, I share writing strategies, and I have teachers in every chapter in content areas like physics and music and phys ed who are sharing their writing strategies for how they get kids to open up and really believe in themselves and what they can do, not just to build their identity in school, but in the years beyond. And so because I taught writing for so many years, this one really, it got me. And it was also like lead like a teacher. I'm glad that you loved it, because it was the hardest one for me to write. I think probably because, it was hardest for me to put myself into that perspective sometimes. But for writing their future selves, it almost wrote itself. I don't think that's going to happen to me again anytime soon.
Well, that's cool. Not that it's not going to happen again. I said that too late.
The writing itself part. I'm writing more books. It's just that this one was it was a joy to write.
Nice. That is awesome. That's very cool. So, well, wish you the best with that. And you got to Give me a holler when it's ready, because I'd love to have you back on the show when you talk about it. And just as a note,
You're on.
Cool. I got to tell you that one of the things I loved about Lead Like a Teacher, though, is that that is it's always been kind of my world, which is as a teacher, and then teacher going into administration, and then administration going from lower level administrator to higher, and you have to remind yourself, you have to keep remembering why you're there, not that this thing over here is just important, or this piece of paper or something like that, because otherwise you just totally forget. Now, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, that we have this shared purpose, which is all about the kids, but there's so many other things out there pulling you different directions that it's like, I could see why some colleagues would go, why don't you know how to do differentiation? Just do it. Yeah, but
It's not that simple.
No, not that simple at all. Anyway, this has been a great talk. Miriam, if someone wanted to follow up and connect with you and or learn more, where would you send them?
Well, I have a website. It's my first and last name, miriamplotinsky.com, and there's a contact form on there. There's also a space where if you want PD, you can click on that link, so you can go a couple different avenues. I also load a lot of resources on there, articles, podcasts, conference stuff that I do. I give it all out because I like to share the knowledge. And then social media-wise, I'm probably the most functional on what I hope will remain, maybe, I don't know if I hope it will remain, Twitter. It's at MirPloMCPS, and I'm very responsive on that as well. I just updated my bio this morning to share. I now have 2 publishers and not just one, so it's always being updated.
Very nice, very nice. Well, good stuff. I will have all that information in my show notes, so it's easy to find for the listeners as well. And I got one last question for you, and the last question is just something I like to ask my guests. So how do you keep going when so much is going on that you may want to quit?
I think I'm going to go back to what I said before, which is that we have to remain grounded in why we got into this. And for me, it's always been about the kids. Part of what moved me to write my next book is the kids who don't feel seen. They are misattributed as being quiet or unengaged or all sorts of other horrible, worse things to say about them that aren't true. And I just try to be there for them and to think about what they're going through and to keep the focus where it belongs, which is not on the politics, it's not on all the stuff that I get into in this book. It's a byproduct of working in a school, but the most important thing is how they're doing. And that's a big thing. I do believe also, I believe in public education. I believe in fighting for public education. I think we're in more of a fight now than we've been for a long time. And that keeps me where I am. It's meaningful. I see the impact. And that's really all there is to it.
That's so awesome. We have a lot of people, I think they forget what their purpose is. And so that allows them to give in to the feelings of overwhelm or burned out or something like that. And thank you so much for offering that up. Good stuff. You want to say something?
Thanks. No, I was going to say, I'm not going to knock the people who feel that way because I get it. Everyone's different. So I feel bad that a lot of people are in that space and I wish it were different. I wish that we were handling it differently as a country. Understand.
Well, I appreciate it. Great thoughts there. Miriam, thanks so much for talking with me. Your book, Lead Like a Teacher, How to Elevate Expertise in Your School, is awesome. A must read for all wanting to be effective in a leadership role in a school. Can't say enough about it. Wishing you success in everything you do.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on, and thanks for all the glows. I always appreciate that.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.